It's taken 15 years for me to get confident enough to stand in front of customers and talk about their trailer. At that rate, I've got another 40 or 50 years before this gets comfortable. Today, I've got a 13-year-old nephew standing at the podium. When I found out about that, I thought it was pretty neat. And then I found out his topic, and I thought it would be cool that if we spoke on the same topic. So right now, this very hour, the same message is being proclaimed by the same men of the same family. That's pretty cool. Our message today is a story that is well understood. It's been taught at every level of learning. Our story comes from 1 Samuel chapter 17. You know the story well. We're going to do our best to share it at the 11 o'clock hour, and then we're going to reapproach it at 2 o'clock. 1 Samuel chapter 17. David and Goliath. Before we start our message, I want you to hear this. A young lady was out in the yard playing. During the play, she lost her contact lens. When she realized she had lost her contact, she was on the ground, hands and knees, thumbing through the grass. Soon, 10 minutes went by, then 20, then 30 minutes. She decided she needs some help. She gets up, she comes inside the house, and the first one she comes by is Daddy. She says, Daddy, I need help finding my contact. I've lost my contact, and I've looked forever. Okay. He says, show me where it's at. So she goes outside, she leads him outside, and she says it's in this area somewhere. So you get both of them are down on their hands and knees, they're thumbing through the grass. A few minutes goes by, Daddy says, here it is. The daughter hops up and runs over. She says, I looked forever, how did you find it so quick? Daddy says, well, I trust it's because you were looking for a contact. I was looking for $150. There you go. See, the perspective is something that we all face. Perspective is the understanding and how we approach every situation. There are always going to be more than one perspective of everything. It will affect and alter any and everything that we take on. This morning, as we discuss 1 Samuel chapter 17, we're going to talk about David and Goliath. We're going to talk about Goliath and the perspective that they had. This hour, we're going to stay with Saul the majority of the time. King Saul, we're going to look at his perspective. We're going to brush across David for a bit, but we'll come back to him at 2 o'clock to get a better understanding. 1 Samuel chapter 17. We're going to start in verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah. And they camped between Succoth and Azekah and Ephes Dammim. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. Then a champion came on out from the armies of the Philistines, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with a scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs, and bronze javelins slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like the weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. We will acknowledge the perspective that Saul had at this time. The Philistine, Goliath, stood 6 cubits high. A cubit is 18 inches. A span is half of a cubit. That's 9 inches. So Goliath, this is to help us to see the size. 9 foot 9 inches would have been to the top of his head. Now, the measurements and the scales have always been challenged by people. They want to dumb it down so we can get our heads wrapped around it. Today, we're going to approach the Scripture with what the Scripture says. 9 foot 9 inches. And we understand, as it's usual, the individuals or people, or their wingspan is the same as their height. So Goliath would have had a wingspan, theoretically, of 9 foot 9 inches. If we take it as what it said, Goliath would have been this figure behind us. He carried a spear, which the tip of the spear weighed 600 shekels, 15 pounds. The spear is usually the size of the man. Spear would have been 9 to 10 foot long. That's used for hand-to-hand combat. The javelin that he had swung between his shoulders is what he threw. So we're going to put his spear in his left hand. We're making him right-handed today. He would have had the sword in his right hand. Now it was in a sheath, wasn't it? David drew it from the sheath. So you stand there and you've got this Goliath of Gath standing on one side calling to the armies of Israel, and when he would have done that, he would have had his hands stretched as far as I'm concerned. Could you imagine such a man? Keep in mind perspective. Perspective will affect anything and everything we go to do. Could we have pulled ourselves out of the perspective of such a man? Saul had always been one that had looked at the outer appearance, even from the beginning when Saul worked on coming into the Lord in chapter 9. Saul in chapter 9 was out looking for the donkeys. His father's donkeys, you remember? And as he was going, he had said, we need to take and stop the search. My father and my family is probably getting worried for me. In chapter 9, starting in verse 19, we see that Saul approaches the seer. He wants to take and find the seer. He wants help to learn where the donkeys may be. He approaches the seer. The seer happens to be Samuel, starting in verse 19 of chapter 9. Samuel answered Saul and said, I am the seer. Go up before me to the high place, for you shall eat with me today, and in the morning I will let you go. And will tell you all that is on your mind. As for the donkeys which were lost 3 days ago, don't set your mind on them, for they have been found. And for whom is all that is desirable in Israel? Is it not for you and for all your father's household? Saul replied, Am I not a Benjaminite, the smallest of the tribes of Israel? And my family the least in all the families of the tribes of Benjamin. Why then do you speak to me in this way? You see, Saul had seen with his eyes. We understand at this point we probably would have done the same thing. Saul viewed himself to be small. At this very time, he had yet to see God's view, God's perspective. We get into chapter 11. We see Saul again, starting in verse 5. Now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen. Up at this point, at the first part of chapter 11, the Ammonites have taken and they have agreed to not kill the Israelites, but they have claimed a treaty on, you will gouge out the right eye of everyone. People are coming in, they're weeping. Saul witnesses this. Now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen. And he said, what is the matter with the people that they weep? So they related to him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he became very angry. He took yoke of oxen and cut them into pieces, and he sent them throughout the territory of Israel and by the hand of the messenger, saying, Whoever does not come after Saul and I, so it shall be done to his oxen. Saul had witnessed a disastrous moment. He was concerned. He was concerned for his people. His people were concerned, and he did what he knew to do. He saw with his eyes. He took the image in front of him, the thing that he had his hands on, and he made an example. He sent it out through the entire tribes of Israel and said, if you don't come out with Samuel and I will do the same to your oxen. Up to this point, we're still good with Samuel or Saul as far as I'm concerned. I don't see anything wrong. Well, let's turn over to chapter 13. We have the understanding. Whoa, now hold on. Back up with me. I told you I still had 40 or 50 years before I got comfortable with this. In between this time, Saul is publicly chosen as king. This is another example where Saul sees with his eyes, he understands with his eyes. Israel desired a king. We're going to stay in chapter 10. Israel decided they needed a king. They needed a man to go out and stand and fight before them. They wanted to be like everybody else. God had declared, I am your king. I am the one that brought you out of Egypt. I'm the one that has kept and saved and protected you up until this point. The people still declared a king. Samuel told them, when you have a king, your sons and daughters will serve him. They will walk before him. He will take your families. We want a king. Saul is anointed as king. When he was anointed as king, he saw himself to be little. We got chapter 10, verse 20. Samuel has brought the tribes in. Thus Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by Lot. Then he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its families, and the matriarch family was taken. And Saul the son of Kish was taken. But when they looked for him, he could not be found. Therefore they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? So the Lord said, behold, he is hiding himself among the baggage. So they ran and took him from there. All right, the point there, and that was before the chapter 11, the Amorites. The point there is the king that they were requesting, he had himself hidden with the luggage. That was their king. Perspectives. Saul still saw himself. Saul still witnessed, viewed himself as being small, unworthy to take and hold God's position. Saul had already been told that he was going to lead the Israelites. He already told that he was going to be king over God's people. Saul had yet to buy into that. We've got the story of the Amorites where he took and he sent out the oxen that had been cut up into pieces. He had the visual appeal. Saul still was looking with his eyes. Now we're going to be in chapter 13. Chapter 13, we're going to be over in verse 8. War with the Philistines and Saul lasted as far and as long as he knew. War with the Philistines and Saul did never cease. In chapter 13 we have Saul battling the Philistines, and Saul knew well how and what he was supposed to do. He also knew what was not to be done. Starting in verse 8, now he waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, bring to me the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and to greet him. But Samuel said, what have you done? Saul knew that sacrifice needed to be made to God to have God on his side. Saul knew that so well that he forced himself to do it, we later read. But he also knew that he wasn't the man to do it. You see, again, Saul's view was physical. It was literal. It had to be in front of him. He never saw beyond his reach. His perspective was always at hand. It can't go any further than at hand with Saul. Chapter 15. Saul again has the challenge of war. And chapter 15 is him going and doing just that. Up in the verse 1 of chapter 15, and Samuel said to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has, and do not spare him. You know the story. Saul not only spared Amalek, the very man that he was told not to spare, he brought back the best of the livestock. And interestingly enough, on down in the chapter, we understand that he approaches Samuel and he tells Samuel, I have done everything that the Lord has declared. And Samuel says, what is this bleating in my ear? The bleating of sheep in my ear. What is this? The people brought back the best of the livestock to sacrifice to your God, he says. Saul's perspective is still in front of him. He can't see past what is at hand. So we're setting the stage here to understand the man that was witnessing the Goliath. Over in verse 22 of chapter 15, Samuel makes it clear, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. We're back in chapter 17. Saul could not get past his perspective the entire time, from the time he took on the role of the Lord until he's standing here in front of the Philistines with Goliath on the other side, has always been in front of him. He can't see past his perspective. Recognize that. His perspective was in front of him. He never was able to find his niche with God and his perspective. Fortunately, we have a man that comes in later. We see in verse 11, it's clear what Saul, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Verse 24, when all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. The men of Israel said, have you seen the man who is coming up? Saul had led his people with a vision of only in front of him. The king of the Israelites could only see what he could touch. Fortunately for us, we have an example in the scriptures of a man that saw beyond that. We have David. David leads us by example on how we can approach and what we can do. Verse 17 of chapter 17. Then Jesse said to David his son, take now for your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to your brothers. Bring also these 10 cuts of cheese to the commander of their 1,000, and look into the welfare of your brothers, and bring back news of them. Jesse had employed David with a task. David's task was to take the ration to the front line, to the army, and was to bring back word to Jesse on how the sons were doing. David takes that task up. Verse 20. So David arose early in the morning and left the flock with the keeper and took the supplies and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the circle of the camp while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up in battle array, army against army. Then David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper, ran to the battle line, and entered in order to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, behold, the champion of the Philistine from Gath, named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. David now is ingrained. Now David's invested into this. He hears the Goliath. He hears the man from Gath. Possibly it's to David's blessing that he hears him but doesn't see him, because we've established. But the way David carries himself later, that doesn't hold, does it? David's a man that has a vision, a perspective, different than Saul, doesn't he? We come on down to verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who were standing with him, saying, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Again, down in verse 34. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb from the flock. I went after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. You see David's perspective? Do you see David's motivation for the perspective? David doesn't see this man of Gath to be a Goliath. Jonathan has the same perspective back in verse 14. Let me read it for you. Verse 14, or chapter 14, verse 6. Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, come and let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us. For the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few. Do you see? David's perspective is different. Like the man of Gath, we too are going to have our Goliaths. And we have Saul's perspective and we have David's perspective. We are going to incorporate one of those perspectives. The anatomy of a Goliath is anything that is overwhelming. Anything that stands above you. Anything that makes you feel little, inadequate, insecure. Anything that emotionally shuts you down. That's the anatomy of a Goliath. We all here have had, are having, or will have a Goliath. We will not escape having a Goliath. Facing a Goliath. These two perspectives are things that we're going to have to recognize. Facing a Goliath never does it when we're ready. Saul, for 40 days, stood the hillside, facing this Goliath. Day and night, he came out and taunted the armies of Israel. We're going to find our Goliaths at home. We're going to face our Goliaths at work. We're going to face our Goliaths at school. We very well may face our Goliath sitting in this room right here. When you face your Goliaths, pick a perspective. Look at David's perspective here. Back up in verse 26 again. Then David spoke to the men who were standing with him, saying, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine, who takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God?" David's perspective is this Philistine, this man from Gath, is uncircumcised. What does that mean? David sees this man from Gath as being uncircumcised. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 17 for that to explain. David's perspective is motivated because this Philistine is uncircumcised. We're going to start in verse 9 of chapter 17. God said further to Abraham, "Now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep. Between me and you and your descendants after you, every male among you shall be circumcised. And you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house, or who is bought with money from any foreigner, who is not of your descendants. A servant who is born in your house, or who is brought with you with your money, shall surely be circumcised. This shall be my covenant. Be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. Be an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." To be circumcised in the Old Testament means you were in covenant with God. A covenant, a divinely ordained relational bond. When God wanted to attach himself to something or something to himself, God made a covenant. In the Old Testament, it was circumcision. David's perspective of this man of Gath was that he was not circumcised. David's view of this Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17 was that he was not with God. David's view was this Goliath was unprepared. He had come to the battle ill-equipped. Chapter 17, starting in verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. I will give the dead bodies of the armies of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give it into your hands." Give it into our hands. David understands that this Philistine, this man of Gath, isn't no more a Goliath than anyone else. The anatomy of a Goliath is something that stands above you, towers above you, and makes you feel small. David feels none of that. He understands that he's equipped for the battle. This man of Gath is not. Perspective. Perspective can alter and affect any situation we come to face. We are going to have one of two perspectives, at least in my experience. We're going to have the perspective of Saul. What stands in front of me is overwhelming and I cannot handle it. Or we can have the perspective of David. My Goliath is not of God. We have that resource. We see in Luke chapter 22 that Jesus has made a new covenant. Jesus himself, when he broke bread with his disciples, chapter 22, verse 19, and when he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And the same way he took the cup after he had eaten, saying, "This cup is poured out for you, is the new covenant in my blood." A covenant, a divinely ordained relational bond. We have that opportunity. We have that covenant. Because we have that covenant, we can face our Goliaths. Our Hebrew writer helped us understand more about this new covenant. Hebrew chapter 9. Starting in verse 14. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? For this reason he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the purpose of the eternal inheritance. For where a covenant is, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. Down in verse 22. And according to the law, one may almost say that all things are cleansed with blood, and without shedding of blood there is no forgiveness. Verse 15. The covenant is made in death, and in death you find the blood. Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6, verse 3. Or do you not know that all of us have been baptized into Christ Jesus, have been baptized into his death? Therefore we have been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. Our perspective is going to be one of two. It's going to be the perspective of Paul or Saul, or it's going to be the perspective of David. We can face our Goliaths with David's perspective, but there's a catch. You have to be of the covenant. You have to be baptized in the blood of Christ for the forgiveness of sin. And in doing that, you can stand and face your Goliaths. But the truth is the contrary. If you haven't done that, your Goliaths may always reign. There may be a time when we're facing our Goliath of death and we will not know where we go if we're not in the covenant. This congregation is here for the sole purpose to make sure that all has the opportunity to be in covenant with God. If there's anyone here that is needing the blood of Christ, the cleansing blood of Christ for the forgiveness of sin, to be in covenant with God, to be able to stand and face your Goliaths, we ask that you take this time to come as we stand and as we sing.